Rome rose to the pinnacle of its extraordinary power and glory in the 200 years after Christ. It grew until the empire united all lands from Spain to Syria and from Scotland to Egypt. More prosperity, more stability, and more peace than the Western world had ever seen. But there was nothing mystical about the chaos of the 3rd century. Quite simply, the empire had become unmanageable. Emperors could no longer cope with the monster Rome had become. Political power was concentrated in too few hands. Rome had turned its back on the common man. Destitute families flooded into the city, swelling the ranks of sweatshop workers and the urban poor.
The proletariat are idle, lazy, and devote their whole life to drink, gambling, brothels, shows, and chariot races. Their temple, their dwelling, their meeting place, in fact, the center of all their desires, is the Circus Maximus. They talk about nothing else. Ammianus.
By the 3rd century AD, the number of days devoted to games had risen from a handful to a staggering 170 each year.
People became obsessed by these games, by watching races, by watching gladiatorial events, by watching whatever it is that was put on for their amusement. I think that often people say that that's what's happening to the modern world. We're more interested in sport, more interested in watching games than we are in working. But I think it puts it in some perspective if you understand how far the Romans went. And we've got a long, long way to go. Being a couch potato now is a lot different than being a Colosseum potato 2,000 years ago.
Intent on distracting themselves, most Romans didn't notice the social fabric of their empire shredding all around them. Rome's sense of community had disappeared. The elite were increasingly isolated from the poor. In the provinces and periphery of empire, resentment festered. The great Roman orator Cicero had foreseen it all.
Words cannot express, gentlemen, how bitterly we will be hated among foreign nations because of the outrageous conduct of the men we have sent to govern them. All the provinces are complaining about Roman greed and Roman injustice. I remind you, gentlemen, Rome will not be able to hold out against the whole world. I do not mean against its power and arms in war, but against its groans and tears and lamentations.
From the beginning, Rome had built its empire by conquest and force of arms. In the early days of empire, there had been real benefits to being defeated by Rome. Citizenship, civil rights, trade, and prosperity. But by the 3rd century AD, those benefits were evaporating. Citizenship was giving way to slavery. Peace and prosperity replaced by shameless exploitation.
And for all the wealth that Rome took from Asia, 3 times as much shall Asia take from Rome, visiting upon her accursed arrogance. And for every slave in a Roman house, I swear, 20 Romans will one day be sold into the most wretched slavery.
In April 248 AD, the Emperor Philip staged the Millennium Games. Rome was 1,000 years old and celebrating its birthday in the only way it knew how. With a grandiose spectacle of ritual, races, and bloodletting. As As Romans celebrated, barbarian armies hammered the empire's frontiers. Rebellions were breaking out in the provinces. With their world collapsing into chaos, the Roman thirst for macabre distraction grew. Nature itself seemed to be conspiring against the Roman Empire. Climatic changes in Central Asia were freezing the high plateaus and forcing its nomadic peoples to migrate. Shut out of the Chinese lowlands, they had no option but to move west. As they headed for Europe, they pushed all the tribes in their path further west as well. In the 3rd century, wave after wave of uprooted peoples were pushed up against Rome's northeastern frontier. Goths, Slavs, Vandals, and more. In 259 AD, Persians attacked. Rallying to the empire's defense, the Emperor Valerian marched his legions hundreds of miles to confront them. Weakened by illness and exhaustion, they were massacred. The disaster of Valerian's defeat had sparked panic throughout the empire. There was a furious recruitment drive. By the year 300, there were almost 500,000 Roman soldiers, and the legions were still growing. The only way to maintain this gigantic military machine was taxation. Taxes rose and inflation spiraled. Roman currency, the denarius, was progressively devalued. Once again, ordinary Romans bore the brunt. Beset by enemies without and turmoil within, the empire tried desperately to tighten its grip. Along with the army, the whole apparatus of imperial power began to swell. Bureaucracies multiplied. The people who oversaw the postal system, the speculatores, had become the world's first full-fledged intelligence operation. Spies were everywhere, reporting any signs of rebellion in the provinces. Emperors were obsessed with maintaining control. Rome was moving slowly but surely towards the totalitarian regimes that would preside over its final collapse. On October 26, 312 AD, rival Roman armies massed outside the city, waiting to do battle. At the head of one was a young commander called Constantine. Constantine looked up into the sky. He saw a cross of light that seemed to burn itself into the heavens, and above it the words, "In hoc signo vinces," "By this sign you will conquer." He had crosses painted on the shields of his troops. The next day, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he smashed the armies of his rival, Maxentius. But he went even further, declaring himself a Christian. Romans were stunned. Most thought Christianity was just another weird Eastern sect. Suddenly, their new emperor had declared himself a cult member. They thought they had another lunatic on their hands. They didn't. Constantine cleverly saw how Christianity could unify an empire coming apart at the seams. Unlike Rome's pagan religion, it preached discipline, obedience, and only one God.
Constantine is one of the most dynamic figures in Roman history. He presented himself as a new Moses, leading his people to a promised land. But I think he saw himself being guided by the hand of a God. And after all, it's one God who's in charge, just as there's one emperor who's going to be in charge.
Under Constantine, Roman unity was reborn. He had no liking for Rome and recognized it had become strategically irrelevant. All the important conflicts in the empire were now along the frontiers to the east and north. So he moved the empire's capital to the ancient city of Byzantium and renamed it after himself, Constantinople.